Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week, the Republican slates for the November congressional elections are locked down after Tuesday's runoffs. How safe are the Mississippi incumbents left standing? And will the GOP win back control over the House and Senate? Republican strategist Austin Barbour offers his take. And we're looking at inflation this morning as consumers buckle under the impact of rising prices. We'll get a no-spin analysis from Dr. Martha Olney on the road ahead for America's economy. That's all ahead this Sunday on Mississippi Insight. Palazzo and Cassidy are out, Guest and Ezell are in, and Thompson and Kelly look set to coast to re-election in the November general elections. Republican Trent Kelly from the 1st District beat out all primary challengers on June 7th, as did Democrat Benny Thompson in the 2nd District. Michael Guest from the 3rd won his runoff election Tuesday against Michael Cassidy, but challenger Mike Ezell beat our incumbent Stephen Palazzo in the 4th District. We spoke with Republican strategist Austin Barbour about the GOP's prospects for congressional takeovers following a very busy primary season in Mississippi. What's your takeaway from last Tuesday's runoff elections? Michael Guest survived, Stephen Palazzo did not. Your thoughts?
You know, not really surprised with either result. I think you and I had a conversation on primary night about how surprising it was that Guest ended up in the situation that he was in, and it really wasn't surprising to see Congressman Palazzo in a real struggle to try to hold on his seat. And of course, Palazzo representing the Pine Belt and Gulf Coast, and to see all of the individuals who came in 3rd, 4th, and 5th in the 4th congressional district race come out and immediately support Sheriff Mike Ezell, solidified, the position that Ezell needed to be in to defeat an incumbent. And it's tough. I think Palazzo first got elected in 2010, so he was a 6th-term incumbent. That's difficult to beat an incumbent. So congratulations to Mike Ezell. And then in the 3rd congressional district, I'm not surprised to see Guest hold on. His team was surprised, of course, that they were in such a tight race in the primary, but they were lucky to get to live another day. And they took advantage of that, and they rallied their troops, and they ended up winning 2-1. So I'm not shocked really by either result, Byron.
Well, next up are the November general elections for all 4 congressional districts. We're sure to see a new congressman in the 4th District, Republican or Democrat. How secure are the remaining incumbents come fall?
Oh, they're secure. They're locked in. There's not going to be a problem for the 1st congressional, 2nd. They'll all win. As you said, we'll have a new member of Congress from the 4th congressional district, and the incumbents in the 3rd, the 2nd, and the 1st. We'll have relatively worry-free general election nights in November.
What do you think Michael got out of this in the 3rd congressional district? What lesson learned here?
Yeah, listen, I think he learned some lessons, but some other incumbents who are watching, who are state legislators or who are statewide elected officials who come up next year in 2023, learned you can't take anything for granted in politics. There's no question that the electorate in Mississippi and across the country is angry. They're upset about the cost of gas. They're upset about the cost of groceries. They're upset about sort of the state of the country right now. And they're angry, whether they're Republicans or independents or Democrats. And they're letting their voice be heard, and they certainly did in the 3rd congressional district race. And I think Congressman Guest realizes, you know what, I got to run scared in every election that I ever have. Even if someone tells me I'm going to win 80-20, I got to run like it's, I'm down 5 points.
Historical trends point to a strong midterm showing for Republicans. Do you expect a GOP takeover this year in either House or Senate or both?
I expect it in both. The Senate is a tight race. The Senate is currently in a situation where it's a 50-50 split with the vice president cast. It's either 50-50 or 51-49, excuse me, and my numbers may be off, but it's super close. I do expect the Republicans to take control of the Senate, and I think the House will absolutely be that way. The Democrats have a 8 to 12 seat majority in the House. That's not going to last. President Biden's favorability rates throughout the country are historically low for any presidential for any president, they're in real trouble. And listen, the reality is gas prices are probably not going down, unfortunately. Grocery prices are not getting any cheaper. So that's gonna play at the ballot against the party that's in charge. And the party that's in charge in Washington, D.C. is the Democrat Party. They're in control of the White House, they're in control of the U.S. House of Congress, and the Senate.
We've seen conservative justices on the U.S. Supreme Court showing their power to impact policy in the last few weeks. They've announced landmark rulings on abortion rights, gun control, environmental protection, just to name a few. Will Republicans benefit from these legal shifts at the polls, or are you concerned about any potential blowback on Election Day?
Well, if we're just talking pure politics, I mean, all those issues, obviously Roe v. Wade is the one that's garnered the most attention. And it will drive people, it will drive both sides to the ballot box in November. There's no question about that. It'll energize, members of the pro-choice community, but it will also energize those who are pro-life individuals who've been fighting for this for 50 years. So I kind of think ultimately they will sort of negate each other in terms of motivating one side or the other. But we'll see. Obviously, we'll see.
Democratic Congressman Benny Thompson continues to lead the January 6th committee. They're investigating the Capitol Hill riot and potential links to the former president, Donald Trump. Do you see these hearings having any impact, whether to Thompson's re-election bid or congressional elections overall?
No, certainly not Benny Thompson's, a re-election bid. He's going to stay in Congress as long as he wants. That district was, is one that he'll hold on to for a long time because he's got so much power throughout the district, but particularly in his home base of Hinds County, which is where most of the population is located in the 2nd Congressional District. The January 6th hearings are taking place now. Obviously, our midterm elections, general elections are a long time from now. So I just don't know. Things happen, as you know this so well, Byron. Things change. And new big issues pop up. What are we, 4 or 5 months away from November? That's a long time for an issue that not everybody's talking about, but some people are talking about at the end of June to still be talking about in October as we lead into the general election in November.
Are you expecting any kind of October surprise or anything that might come up between now and November that could change the elections or change the outcome come November?
I think the biggest October surprise is how you described it could be if President Biden made an announcement that he was not going to run for re-election. If you listen to the leadership in the Democrat Party, not all, I shouldn't say it like that, but some very recognizable names, they don't want him to run again. They don't dislike him. They're not mad at him. They're not angry at him. They just think that he needs to come out and say, you know what, I'm going to work really hard, work on these key issues for the next 2.5 years, but then I'm not going to run for re-election. I think that's the only November surprise that could potentially motivate Democrats to try to come together to hold at least one chamber in Congress. Otherwise, I can't really foresee anything else. But that certainly will be the big conversation, and it's probably not something that he would announce before then. But we'll see.
And who do you think the Democrats would put up there, or who do you think would be good for the Democrats to put up there if the president did not run again in 2024?
I don't know. I'm a Republican. I'm going to let the Democrats figure that one out.
All right. Austin Barbour, thank you for your insight. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
After the break, what can we do to curb inflation without damaging the economy? More Mississippi Insight is straight ahead. By most measures, Mississippians and the country as a whole are feeling a real strain from inflation. Prices for goods and services have risen at levels not seen since the 1980s. We want to get a better understanding of what has caused inflation to skyrocket and what we might do to bring prices back down to earth. For that, we turn to Dr. Martha Olney. She is a teaching professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Olney, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, let's first understand how economics measure inflation at the consumer and wholesale levels.
So there are two primary measures of inflation at the consumer level. One is the Consumer Price Index, and that comes from one agency of the federal government called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the other is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, and that comes from another agency, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. There's a little bit of difference between what's included in these indices and how they're constructed, and so we get slightly different numbers. Most people who have heard the inflation number hear the CPI, the first one, the CPI number. And most recently, that was an increase of 8.6% in May for year-over-year inflation. It was slightly higher in the South. It was 9.2 for the Southern region as a whole. And that's the number that a lot of us have been hearing. The number that the Federal Reserve uses to guide their policy is the second one. So the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. That's the one that came out this morning. And that one is lower. It has to do with how it's constructed and how much it takes into account the patterns we have of substituting cheaper things for more expensive things. And the number that the Federal Reserve uses for guiding their policy has actually been coming down. So it was lower this month than it had been in April, lower for May than it had been in April, lower in April than March, lower in March than in February. So that one's actually trending down. It's still higher than it's been for the last 40 years.
So, Doctor, how did we get here, and what factors led to today's inflationary pressures?
How did we get here? Well, there's this thing called the pandemic, and that's really what started the whole thing. So, when we understand inflation, we understand it as this combination of supply and demand. So those of us who've taken economics, I have to say that most people who take economics probably don't remember a whole lot from their economics class, and that's no shade on them at all. That's shade on my colleagues. But if you do remember something from economics, you remember supply and demand, where there was this demand curve and supply curve, and they determined prices, and that's really a key piece. And so the first thing that happened early in the pandemic was increases in demand because we changed what we were buying. We started buying many more goods and fewer services. We couldn't go to restaurants or travel or go to the theater, movie theaters, but we were buying electronics. People were trying to buy cars to commute if there was no longer public transit available or they had relocated. And so there was a shift in what we were buying towards goods and away from services. And that put upward pressure on the prices of goods. And then remember early in the pandemic, we were talking about supply chain disruptions. And when we first were talking about it, we were talking about all the ships that were in the ports and the difficulty those ships were having in just getting into berth and unloading the goods onto the docks. And that was a disruption in the supply of goods. And then there have been ongoing, as the various lockdowns, for instance, in Shanghai and other places continue, there have been various other supply disruptions. And those supply disruptions, well, that's another factor that makes prices go up. So more buying, more demand makes prices go up, less supply, fewer goods available to sell, that makes prices go up. And then the war in Ukraine started earlier this year, and that also has contributed to higher prices, particularly in terms of fuel prices because of the sanctions on Russia and the impact on Russian exports of oil, which is part of a global oil market. And then more recently, the impact on food prices, because Ukraine is the wheat basket of the world, is one of the greatest contributors to wheat exports, and their ability to grow and export their wheat has been impacted, of course, by the war. And so we've just had one thing after another, started with the pandemic, but then is the war in Ukraine sort of piled on top of that, all of which contributed to these prices going up.
Is there any sign of relief for consumers in the near term?
I think the signs of relief are beginning to be seen. I'm hesitant. So it's like they're beginning to be seen there, particularly as you look at this inflation, the core inflation that the Fed pays attention to, the one that doesn't include the food prices and the energy prices. The fact that that's been trending down for the last 4 months, I think, is a very good sign. The Federal Reserve is doing what it can to try to slow demand in an effort to slow the growth of prices, and that's what they've been doing with increasing interest rates. And so the Fed, that starting back in March, has been increasing interest rates. They'll probably do so another 2 or 3 times in 2022, and that's an effort to reduce the demand for the kinds of things that we buy where we need to borrow money to buy them. So houses, cars, appliances, furniture, those sorts of things. Those interest rates are impacted when the Federal Reserve changes the interest rates, and the hope is to slow the growth in demand for those kinds of goods.
Is it likely we're going to see a recession? Because there's been a lot of talk that we're heading that way. What's your thoughts on that?
The hope is, there we go, the hope is that the Fed can engineer what they're calling a soft landing. And by a soft landing, they mean that instead of the economy growing at, say, 2.5%, 3% per year, if they could make the economy grow at, say, 1.5% per year, that would slow down the growth in demand for goods and could release some of this pressure on prices without actually causing a recession. So a recession is when the amount of goods and services that we're producing is less in 1 month than it was the month before, and less in the month after that, and even less in the month after that. And so we're hoping that to avoid a recession, we're hoping to avoid constricting demand so much that the amount of goods and services produced in the country actually contracts or gets smaller month after month. But the hope is that instead of growing at, say, as I said, instead of growing at like 3% per year, it grows at, say 1% per year. The labor market right now is in some of the best shape it's been for decades. We've got one of the lowest unemployment rates we've had in a very long time. And so there's a lot of room for the Fed to be increasing interest rates without necessarily triggering a recession.
And a lot of talk about gas prices. Are we going to see gas prices go down? Are we going to see them go up, or just hold steady where they are now?
Gas prices are historically very volatile. And so, if you look at the pattern of gas prices and you see these times when they go up, I remember, so I have to trigger this with when my mother was alive, and my mother died in 2009. So I remember before my mother died, prices here in California were $5 a gallon, and then they came back down to, something really, really low. And so absolutely, I would expect them to come back down just because of the nature of gas markets. But a lot of that is again related to what's happening globally in terms of geopolitics. And so we just have to see how that whole situation unfolds.
What would your message be to consumers and to Americans who are struggling to pay rent, struggling to get to work with the price of gas? What's the message to Americans?
This is not a good time. It's difficult. It's challenging. And I think that everyone is very aware of that. And there's a sense of urgency to address the problem because people are suffering. There are people for whom they're making choices between food and rent and gas and medicine and other pieces. And so absolutely bringing these prices down is important.
Dr. Olney, thank you for your insight. We appreciate your time and joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here.
All righty, and we'll be right back. A specially appointed state judge has set this Tuesday for a first hearing in a lawsuit by Mississippi's only abortion clinic. The Jackson Women's Health Organization wants to block the state's abortion ban. Mississippi is one of several states with a trigger law contingent on the U.S. Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. Right now, the law is set to take effect 2 days after the hearing. It says abortion will be legal in Mississippi only if the pregnant woman's life is in danger or if a pregnancy is caused by a rape reported to law enforcement. It does not have exceptions for pregnancies caused by incest. A comment last week by House Speaker Philip Gunn on abortion and incest drew lots of attention from national media. The Republican speaker reiterated his opposition to a legal exception for incest victims. Gunn told news media, quote, "I believe that life begins at conception and every life is valuable. Those are my personal beliefs," end quote. A reporter then asked whether a 12-year-old incest victim should have to carry a pregnancy to term. Gunn responded, quote, "That is my personal belief," end quote. Well, earlier in the week, Gunn talked on social media about forming a Speaker's Commission on Life. He says House appointees and policy experts will work specifically to improve child protection and foster care and make adoption more available and affordable and boost child support enforcement. We'll be right back. We want to hear from you at Mississippi Insight and 12 News. Just email the producers at this address, news@wjtv.com. Send us your comments, your questions, your segment ideas. That's news@wjtv.com. Thanks to Austin Barbour and Dr. Martha Olney for their insights this week. And we want to thank you for watching. We're back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.